My husband's brother's wedding planner called. Your husband canceled your invitation, but asked to keep the $40,000 deposit you paid. I said, cancel the entire wedding. She gasped, but ma'am, you're not the bride. No, but I own the venue, the catering company, and the hotel chain they booked for guests. I'm calling to confirm the final details for the Henderson Walsh wedding, Mrs. Morrison. The vendor's voice carried routine professionalism that would shatter within minutes. However, we received some conflicting instructions from your husband yesterday. He indicated you would no longer be attending but that the financial arrangements should remain unchanged. I felt my grip tighten on the phone as the implications crystallized. Scott had systematically removed me from Frank's wedding celebration while ensuring my $40,000 funding remained in place. The audacity of keeping my money while erasing my presence revealed a calculated betrayal that went far beyond simple family drama. I see, I managed, my voice maintaining the professional composure that had served me through 15 years of building Morrison hospitality from nothing into a southwestern empire. Could you clarify exactly what financial arrangements my husband referenced? Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing stories about finding your voice when others underestimate your worth. If you believe that quiet strength deserves recognition and respect, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to hear this message. Now let's see how this unfolds. The vendor's discomfort became palpable through the phone line. Well, Mrs. Morrison, he specifically mentioned the $40,000 deposit you provided for venue rental, catering, and hotel accommodations. He assured us that despite the guest list changes, those funds should remain allocated as originally planned. I set the phone on speaker and leaned back in my leather chair, staring out at the Phoenix skyline that stretched beyond my corner office windows. 32 floors below, the city hummed with morning traffic while my world reorganized itself around this new understanding of my marriage. Scott had orchestrated my exclusion while preserving access to my checkbook with the casual efficiency of a man who viewed his wife as a renewable resource rather than a human being. The quarterly reports spread across my mahogany desk suddenly felt like evidence in a case I had been unconsciously building for years. Morrison Hospitality's latest figures showed revenue streams that exceeded most Fortune 500 companies, profit margins that made veteran investors envious, and a portfolio spanning 4 states. Yet the man I had shared a bed with for 15 years still introduced me at social gatherings as his wife who helped out with some event planning. Mrs. Morrison, are you still there? The vendor's voice carried genuine concern now. I want to emphasize that this situation feels highly irregular to our team. We've never encountered a scenario where the primary financial contributor was excluded from an event while their funding remained required. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, I replied, my tone carrying the authority that had negotiated hostile takeovers and impossible contracts. I will address this matter directly with my husband. After ending the call, I remained seated in my office sanctuary, surrounded by tangible evidence of achievements Scott's family had never bothered to understand. The Waterford Crystal coffee service I had purchased to celebrate acquiring my 10th venue gleamed in the morning light. Original Southwestern artwork worth more than most people's annual salaries decorated walls that bore witness to phone calls that shaped the hospitality industry across multiple states. My assistant had arranged today's schedule around 3 acquisition meetings that would expand Morrison Hospitality's influence into Nevada. These deals represented months of strategic planning, financial analysis, and relationship building that Scott dismissed as Teresa's little networking activities. The irony never escaped me that my employees, competitors, and industry colleagues treated me with professional respect that my own family had never demonstrated. I remembered the family dinner 3 weeks ago where this betrayal had been planted. Frank had announced his engagement to Sarah with obvious joy tempered by financial anxiety. The conversation around our dining room table had unfolded with painful predictability as Scott's relatives calculated the impossibility of affording their dream wedding. Frank makes decent money as an architect, Teresa had explained through tears, but with Sarah's student loans and the mortgage payments, there's nothing left for a proper celebration. She deserves better than a courthouse ceremony, but we're looking at maybe $5,000 total if we sacrifice everything else. I had listened quietly as they discussed creative budgeting strategies that would have been unnecessary if anyone had bothered to understand the scope of my business success. Bachelor party at a chain restaurant instead of a weekend retreat. Wedding dress from a discount outlet rather than a bridal boutique. Reception dinner at a community center with folding chairs and paper plates. Scott had participated in these discussions with the sympathetic concern of a caring brother, occasionally glancing my way with expectant looks that assumed I might contribute modest assistance through my industry connections. His assumptions never extended to recognizing that I could solve their entire financial dilemma with a check that represented less than 2 days of Morrison hospitality revenue. The conversation had continued for over an hour while I calculated the cost of giving Frank and Sarah everything they had dreamed of. Sunset Ridge Estate for the ceremony, with its panoramic desert views and impeccable service standards. Copper Canyon catering for a reception dinner that would create memories lasting decades. Desert Palm Resort for out-of-town guests, providing luxury accommodations that would make everyone feel genuinely pampered. $40,000 total. Less than I had spent on the furniture arrangement in our living room. A sum that would transform their modest celebration into an experience worthy of the love they shared. When Teresa had approached me privately after dinner, her face streaked with tears as she asked if I knew vendors who might donate services for family, I had made the decision that would ultimately expose the true nature of my relationships. I had written the check that same evening, asking only that my contribution remain anonymous because I believed the best gifts were those given without expectation of recognition or gratitude. I can handle the entire wedding cost, I had told her quietly in our kitchen while Scott watched television in the adjacent room. But I want this to stay between us. Frank and Sarah should enjoy their day without feeling indebted to family members. Teresa's relief had been overwhelming and genuine. She had embraced me with desperate gratitude, treating me like an answered prayer rather than recognizing the routine nature of this generosity for someone with my resources. Neither of us could have anticipated that this moment of family solidarity would eventually become the foundation for systematic betrayal. Now, sitting in my office while processing Scott's casual disposal of our marriage vows, I understood that my anonymous generosity had created the perfect opportunity for exploitation. By keeping my contribution secret, I had enabled Scott to erase me from the celebration while preserving access to benefits I had provided. My desire to give without recognition had been transformed into a weapon for my own humiliation. The morning sun climbed higher beyond my windows, casting sharp shadows across financial reports that documented Morrison Hospitality's continued expansion into new markets. Within hours, my assistant would announce additional calls that would complete my understanding of how thoroughly my own family had betrayed the woman whose success funded their comfortable lifestyles. But for this moment I sat quietly in the empire I had built, finally comprehending that real power whispers while insecurity shouts, and that I had been whispering far too long while others shouted over achievements they could never match or even properly comprehend. My assistant's intercom buzzed again before I could fully process the vendor's revelation. "Mrs. Morrison, I have Diane from Desert Rose Wedding Planning holding on line 4. She mentioned it was urgent regarding the Henderson Walsh event." The timing sent ice through my veins. 2 calls within 10 minutes about the same wedding could only mean catastrophe was unfolding in real time. I pressed the flashing button with fingers that had begun to tremble despite my efforts at professional control. Teresa Morrison speaking. "Mrs. Morrison, thank you for taking my call." Diane's voice carried the particular strain that wedding planners develop when navigating family disasters. "I find myself in an extremely delicate situation that requires your immediate attention. We received some rather conflicting instructions yesterday regarding your involvement in the Henderson Walsh celebration." The word involvement landed with surgical precision. Not attendance or participation, but involvement, as if my connection to Frank's wedding had become something problematic that required management rather than celebration. "What kind of conflicting instructions?" I asked, though part of me already understood where this conversation was heading. "Your husband contacted our office personally yesterday afternoon. He requested that we remove your name from all guest lists, seating charts and formal announcements. However, he was very specific about maintaining all existing financial arrangements exactly as originally established." The professional euphemisms could not disguise the brutal clarity of what Scott had orchestrated. He had systematically erased me from his brother's wedding while ensuring my $40,000 funding remained untouched. The calculated nature of this betrayal made it infinitely more devastating than any impulsive act of anger could have been. He also provided alternative contact information for all future wedding communications. Diane continued, her discomfort growing more apparent with each word. We were instructed to direct all vendor coordination through Teresa Morrison rather than yourself moving forward. Scott's sister-in-law would now serve as the primary contact for an event I had funded entirely. The symbolism was perfect in its cruelty. I would pay for Frank's wedding while being replaced by another Teresa, as if I were an interchangeable piece in family machinery that could be swapped out without affecting functionality. Mrs. Morrison, I want to be completely transparent with you, Diane said, her professional mask slipping slightly. In 15 years of wedding planning, I have never encountered a situation where the primary financial contributor was excluded from an event while their funding was retained. Our entire team feels uncomfortable proceeding under these circumstances without your explicit consent. Even strangers recognized the ethical bankruptcy of what my own husband had arranged. Wedding vendors understood boundaries that Scott apparently considered irrelevant when applied to his wife's dignity and financial resources. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. Scott's name appeared on the screen with a preview that made my stomach clench. I put Diane on hold and opened the message that would redefine my understanding of our marriage. Stop being dramatic. You're not coming to Frank's wedding. We're keeping the money since you offered it as a gift. Let's discuss this when you've calmed down. The casual cruelty took my breath away. 15 years of marriage reduced to a text message that treated me like an inconvenient child whose tantrum required patient management. The dismissive tone revealed how Scott truly perceived me, not as his business-owning wife whose success funded our lifestyle, but as an emotional woman whose legitimate anger represented mere hysteria requiring correction. The phrase, "when you've calmed down," carried particular venom. Scott was preemptively dismissing any response I might have as irrational female emotion rather than justified outrage at calculated betrayal. He had orchestrated my humiliation while stealing my money, then framed my anticipated reaction as unreasonable drama that rational adults should ignore. Mrs. Morrison, are you still there? Diane's voice pulled me back to the phone call that had become secondary to the text message revelation. Yes, I apologize. Please continue. I wanted to ask directly whether you consent to these arrangements. Our standard contracts include clauses protecting financial contributors from unauthorized changes to event coordination, and frankly, this situation appears to violate several industry ethical guidelines. The wedding planner's professional concern highlighted how completely Scott had misunderstood both my business acumen and my industry relationships. He had assumed he could manipulate vendors who answered ultimately to me, dismissing the possibility that his wife might command sufficient respect to expose his schemes. Diane, I need to ask you something directly. Was this decision presented to you as coming from both my husband and myself, or did Scott indicate he was acting unilaterally? The pause that followed confirmed my suspicions. Mr. Morrison presented this as a mutual family decision to avoid potential conflicts during the celebration. He assured us that you had agreed to maintain financial support while stepping back from active participation. Scott had lied to wedding vendors about my consent while simultaneously stealing my money and erasing my presence. The systematic nature of his deception revealed planning that extended far beyond impulsive anger or family pressure. This was calculated betrayal executed with the efficiency of a business transaction. However, Diane continued, he seemed unfamiliar with our standard procedures and asked several questions that suggested he was not fully informed about the scope of services your funding covers. That raised red flags for our team. My phone buzzed again with another message from Scott. Teresa called crying about vendor issues. Fix this mess you created. Frank doesn't need his wedding ruined because you can't handle family decisions like an adult. The victim blaming reached new depths of manipulation. Scott was now positioning me as responsible for chaos created by his own betrayal, while characterizing his theft and humiliation as family decisions that reasonable people should accept without complaint. His casual dismissal of vendor concerns as problems I had created revealed complete disconnection from the reality of what he had attempted. Mrs. Morrison, I need to inform you that several other vendors have contacted our office with similar concerns about conflicting instructions, Diane said, her voice growing more strained. Copper Canyon Catering received a call requesting menu changes without consulting the financial contributor. Desert Palm Resort was instructed to modify guest accommodation arrangements while maintaining the same billing structure. The conspiracy extended far beyond Scott's initial betrayal. He had contacted every vendor associated with Frank's wedding, systematically erasing my involvement while preserving my financial obligations. The audacity of coordinating such extensive deception while characterizing my objections as drama revealed a level of manipulation I had never suspected him capable of achieving. "There's something else you should know," Diane continued hesitantly. "Mr. Morrison mentioned that these changes were necessary because of your tendency toward emotional instability during family events. He suggested that your presence might create uncomfortable situations for other guests. Scott had assassinated my character to justify my exclusion, painting me as an unstable woman whose emotional problems required family management. The man who had benefited from my business success for 15 years was now portraying me as mentally unfit to attend social gatherings, creating a narrative that positioned my exclusion as protective rather than punitive. My reflection in the office window showed a woman whose professional composure was beginning to fracture under the weight of systematic betrayal. My hands shook as I reviewed the wedding contracts spread across my desk. My voice caught slightly when responding to Diane's questions, and my eyes carried a fragility that 15 years of successful business negotiations had never produced. The empire I had built as armor against the world's cruelties felt suddenly meaningless when the people I trusted most had casually decided I was disposable. All my professional achievements meant nothing if my own family could orchestrate my humiliation with such casual efficiency. For the first time in decades, I felt my carefully constructed professional identity beginning to crumble, leaving me exposed to emotions I had learned to manage through success and control. The phone rang barely 30 minutes after I ended the call with Diane. Teresa's name flashed on my office display, and I almost declined the call before curiosity about her justifications overcame my instinct to avoid further pain. "Teresa, thank God you answered." Her voice carried a tremor I had never heard before, higher-pitched and breathless, as if she had been running or crying. "I need to explain what happened. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." "Has there?" I kept my tone neutral, though my heart hammered against my ribs with the desperate hope that perhaps this nightmare had some reasonable explanation I had not considered. "Listen, we were trying to protect you. Scott explained how stressed you've been with work, how the family gatherings have been overwhelming lately. We thought if we handled the wedding details ourselves, you could just relax and enjoy the celebration without all the planning pressure." The explanation sounded rehearsed, each word carefully chosen to reframe betrayal as benevolence. Teresa spoke with the practiced fluency of someone who had spent considerable time crafting this narrative, probably with Scott's guidance and possibly other family members' input. "Teresa, I was uninvited from the wedding entirely. How does that qualify as protecting me from planning pressure?" "Well, that part got complicated." Her voice wavered slightly, the first crack in her prepared script. "There were some family dynamics at play that we thought might create tension. You know how these events can get emotional, and we wanted to keep everything focused on Frank and Sarah's happiness." The euphemisms continued to pile up like defensive barriers. Family dynamics replaced the truth of their coordinated exclusion. Emotional characterized my anticipated reaction to theft and humiliation as unreasonable female hysteria. Frank and Sarah's happiness positioned my presence as somehow threatening to the couple's joy rather than acknowledging that their celebration existed only because of my generosity. "But we absolutely want you to know how grateful we are for your contribution," Teresa rushed on, sensing my silence as skepticism. "That money is going to make their dream wedding possible, and we'll never forget your generosity." The casual reference to keeping my $40,000 while excluding me from the celebration revealed the stunning audacity of their position. They genuinely believed they could steal my money, erase my presence, and maintain my gratitude through hollow expressions of appreciation. "Teresa, whose idea was it to remove me from the guest list?" Another pause, longer this time. "It was a family decision. We all talked it through and agreed that this approach would be best for everyone involved." They had held family meetings about my exclusion. Multiple conversations where Scott's relatives sat around discussing whether the woman funding their celebration deserved to attend it. The systematic nature of this betrayal cut deeper than any spontaneous cruelty could have achieved. "Including Frank? Frank wants whatever's best for family harmony." He's grateful for your support and doesn't want any conflicts to overshadow his special day. Frank's silence became a betrayal unto itself. Hours had passed since the wedding vendors contacted him about the chaos surrounding his celebration, yet he had not called to express concern, confusion, or gratitude. The man whose wedding I had funded completely now hid behind family spokespeople rather than addressing the situation directly. When Frank finally did call, 20 minutes after Teresa's conversation ended, his tone carried the weary obligation of someone completing an unpleasant task rather than the genuine emotion of someone whose dreams had been made possible by family generosity. Teresa, I wanted to personally thank you for your incredible generosity with the wedding expenses. His words sounded formal, almost scripted. Your support means everything to Sarah and me, and we want you to know how much we appreciate your understanding about the guest list situation. My understanding? The phrase escaped before I could moderate my response. Frank, I found out about my exclusion from your wedding through vendor phone calls. What exactly am I supposed to understand? Well, the family thought it might be better to keep things smaller, more intimate. You know how these events can get complicated when there are too many personalities involved. Frank was using the same euphemistic language Teresa had employed, referring to my presence as a personality problem rather than acknowledging his family's calculated betrayal. The man I had considered a genuine friend was revealed as someone who lacked the courage to defend basic decency when family pressure mounted. Frank, I funded your entire wedding. Does that reality factor into your understanding of appropriate guest list decisions? His uncomfortable laughter revealed everything about his moral framework. Teresa, you offered that money as a gift. We're incredibly grateful, but gifts don't come with strings attached, right? The man whose architectural career was built on structural integrity could not recognize the ethical foundation supporting his own wedding celebration. He had transformed my anonymous generosity into an obligation-free windfall that absolved him of any responsibility toward the benefactor. Scott's arrival home that evening brought the final confirmation of how completely my family relationships had disintegrated. Instead of apologies or explanations, he entered our kitchen with the aggressive defensiveness of someone who believed his position was morally justified. I hope you're satisfied with the chaos you've created, he said, dropping his briefcase with unusual force and glaring at me with undisguised resentment. Teresa spent the afternoon crying because vendors are asking inappropriate questions about family decisions. The victim blaming reached breathtaking heights. Scott was positioning me as responsible for vendor confusion created by his own deceptive instructions, while characterizing professional inquiries about irregular financial arrangements as inappropriate questions. You orchestrated my exclusion from Frank's wedding while keeping my money, Scott. The chaos was created by your betrayal, not my reaction to it. Betrayal. His voice rose with genuine indignation. I was trying to prevent family drama and protect Frank's special day. Your success has made you arrogant, Teresa. You think funding something gives you the right to control everything about it. The accusation revealed the deeper resentment that had probably festered throughout our marriage. Scott had watched my business achievements with growing bitterness, interpreting my success as arrogance rather than recognizing the dedication and intelligence that built Morrison Hospitality. This wedding exclusion was not about family harmony but about diminishing a wife whose accomplishments threatened his ego. 15 years of supporting your career, funding our lifestyle, and accepting your family's dismissive treatment, and you think I'm the arrogant one? You see, this is exactly the kind of emotional reaction we were trying to avoid at the wedding. Frank doesn't need his celebration ruined by your need to be the center of attention. Scott was rewriting our marriage history in real time, transforming years of my quiet support and acceptance into attention-seeking behavior that justified his family's coordinated betrayal. The man who had benefited daily from my success now painted me as a narcissist whose presence would ruin celebrations funded by her own generosity. That night, lying in our king-sized bed while Scott slept peacefully beside me, I confronted the devastating loneliness that follows betrayal by those we trust most completely. The silence stretched between us like an ocean, filled with 15 years of shared memories that now felt like elaborate deceptions. My business empire, my financial independence, my reputation for integrity throughout the hospitality industry. None of these achievements mattered when facing the hollow recognition that my own family had secretly planned my exclusion while depending on my continued generosity. I had spent 15 years building bridges to people who were quietly preparing to burn them the moment I became inconvenient rather than useful. The darkness of our bedroom echoed with conversations I would never have again, family gatherings where I would never feel welcomed, and the recognition that love I had believed unconditional was actually contingent on my continued invisibility and financial accessibility. Morning brought no relief from the emotional devastation of the previous night. I woke to find Scott already gone, having left earlier than usual without explanation or goodbye. The emptiness of our kitchen felt different now, charged with the knowledge that the man I had shared coffee with for 15 years viewed me as an obstacle to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Scott's mother, Margaret, along with a voicemail that carried the carefully modulated tone she reserved for family crises requiring diplomatic intervention. I poured coffee into my favorite mug, the one Scott had given me for our 5th anniversary, and prepared myself for what would undoubtedly be another exercise in family damage control. Teresa, darling, I hope you understand that family situations can become quite complicated. Margaret's recorded voice flowed with practiced smoothness. Scott mentioned there were some concerns about the wedding arrangements, and I wanted you to know that we all appreciate your generous contribution. Perhaps it would be best if we simply let bygones be bygones and focused on Frank's happiness. These sorts of misunderstandings tend to resolve themselves when everyone keeps the bigger picture in mind. The carefully chosen phrases revealed how thoroughly Scott had briefed his family about containing my reaction to their betrayal. Margaret spoke as if witnessing a minor disagreement between children rather than addressing the systematic theft and humiliation orchestrated by her son. Her suggestion to let bygones be bygones positioned my legitimate outrage as petty grievance-keeping that mature adults should abandon for the sake of family harmony. Scott's sister Jennifer called within the hour, her approach slightly different but equally manipulative in its underlying assumption that my reaction was disproportionate to the offense committed. Teresa, I know family dynamics can be really challenging sometimes. Jennifer began with the patronizing sympathy she typically reserved for discussing difficult relatives. Scott explained that there were some tensions around the wedding planning, and honestly, these big events tend to bring out the worst in everyone. Maybe this is actually a blessing in disguise that lets you avoid all that wedding stress. The reframing continued with stunning audacity. Jennifer was characterizing my exclusion from Frank's wedding as a fortunate escape from unpleasant obligations rather than acknowledging the betrayal of trust and theft of money that had actually occurred. Her tone suggested that reasonable people would feel grateful for being spared the burden of attending celebrations they had funded. You know how emotional these occasions can get, especially when there are a lot of strong personalities involved, she continued, her voice carrying the subtle implication that I represented one of those problematic personalities requiring management. Frank and Sarah just want their day to be perfect, and sometimes that means making difficult choices about guest dynamics. Each family member who called employed variations of the same strategy. My exclusion became protection from stress. My financial contribution became a generous gift that should require no reciprocal consideration. My anger became emotional instability that threatened family celebrations. The sophistication of their coordinated response revealed extensive planning and consultation among Scott's relatives. The most disturbing call came from Sarah herself, Frank's fiancée, who demonstrated a level of calculated manipulation that suggested natural talent rather than coached behavior. Her voice carried precisely the right blend of innocence and gratitude to deflect responsibility while maintaining plausible deniability about her role in the conspiracy. Teresa, I wanted to personally thank you for being so understanding about the wedding arrangements. Sarah began with perfectly modulated warmth. I know these family events can get complicated, and your willingness to prioritize Frank's happiness over any personal concerns really shows what kind of person you are. The performance was flawless. Sarah managed to thank me for understanding decisions I had never consented to while positioning my exclusion as evidence of my noble character rather than acknowledging the betrayal that had actually occurred. She spoke as if I had voluntarily withdrawn from the celebration rather than being systematically erased by family conspiracy. Frank is so grateful for your generosity with the wedding expenses, she continued, her tone carrying just enough emotional weight to seem genuine without acknowledging the ethical implications of accepting money from someone they had excluded. He keeps saying how lucky we are to have family members who care more about our happiness than their own recognition. The subtle dig at my supposed need for recognition revealed how thoroughly Scott had briefed his future sister-in-law about my character flaws. Sarah was implying that my objection to theft and humiliation stemmed from wounded vanity rather than legitimate outrage at betrayal. She had transformed my anonymous generosity into evidence of attention-seeking behavior that justified their coordinated exclusion. In stark contrast to the family betrayal, my business relationships proved their worth through unwavering professionalism and loyalty. My assistant spent hours discreetly investigating the vendor connections, mapping the web of companies that ultimately traced back to Morrison Hospitality's various holdings. My legal team reviewed contract obligations with the thoroughness I had come to expect from professionals who understood their reputations depended on competent service. Most telling was the response from Marcus Chin, my closest business partner and the man who had helped structure some of Morrison Hospitality's most complex acquisitions. When I explained the situation during our regularly scheduled call, his reaction carried none of the diplomatic equivocation that characterized my family's responses. "Teresa, that's completely unacceptable behavior," Marcus said without hesitation. "I don't care what family dynamics were involved. You don't take someone's money and then exclude them from the event. That's fraud, plain and simple." His straightforward moral clarity highlighted the twisted ethical framework my family had adopted to justify their actions. The people I paid for professional services demonstrated more integrity and loyalty than blood relatives who had benefited from my generosity for years. "Have you considered that this might be strategic rather than merely cruel?" Marcus continued, his business acumen cutting through the emotional confusion that family betrayal creates. "Excluding you while keeping your funding sends a very specific message about your place in their hierarchy. You're valuable for resources but not worthy of inclusion in celebrations." His analysis illuminated what I had been struggling to understand. This was not random cruelty or impulsive family drama but calculated degradation designed to establish permanent boundaries. They were teaching me that I could fund their happiness but should never expect to share in it. The sophistication of their emotional manipulation revealed years of resentment and planning I had never recognized. The pattern became clearer as additional family members contacted me throughout the week. Each conversation followed the same script. My exclusion became protection. My funding became generous gifting that required no reciprocal consideration. My anger became emotional instability that reasonable people should ignore for the sake of family harmony. They had all known about the plan. Scott's parents, his siblings, even distant relatives who rarely involved themselves in family affairs had been consulted about my exclusion while my funding was preserved. The entire extended family had participated in deciding that I was expendable, that my contributions were welcome while my presence was problematic. The realization settled over me like cold water. I had spent 15 years believing I was building relationships with people who valued my presence in their lives. Instead, I had been cultivating dependencies among people who viewed me as a convenient resource to be managed and manipulated according to their needs. The network of deception extended far beyond Scott's impulsive betrayal. This was systematic exclusion coordinated by an entire family who had decided that my money was welcome while my company was not. The revelation of systematic family betrayal demanded a response that matched its calculated cruelty. I spent that evening in my home office, surrounded by 15 years of acquisition documents, corporate filings, and subsidiary records that told the story of Morrison Hospitality's expansion across the southwestern United States. My legal team worked remotely through the night, mapping connections I had never considered in their totality. What emerged from our investigation transformed my understanding of the power I had unconsciously accumulated. Desert Rose Wedding Planning operated under the umbrella of Southwest Event Solutions, which I had acquired 3 years earlier during their bankruptcy proceedings. Sunset Ridge Estate, the venue Frank and Sarah had selected for its breathtaking desert views, belonged to my hospitality division through a holding company that managed 12 similar properties. Copper Canyon Catering answered to Morrison Hospitality through a subsidiary structure so complex that even industry insiders rarely traced the ultimate ownership. Most significantly, Desert Palm Resort, where all 60 wedding guests had confirmed reservations, represented the crown jewel of my hotel portfolio, a property I had purchased and renovated into one of Phoenix's most sought-after luxury destinations. Every vendor, every service provider, Every aspect of Frank's celebration connected directly to companies I controlled through strategic acquisitions that had seemed routine at the time but now revealed themselves as instruments of unprecedented leverage. The family who had dismissed my business as Teresa's little catering thing had unknowingly constructed their entire wedding celebration on the foundation of my corporate empire. They had insulted and excluded the woman who literally owned every component of their dream celebration. My phone call to Diane the following morning carried an authority I had never exercised with such focused precision. When I identified myself as the ultimate owner of Desert Rose Wedding Planning, the silence that followed stretched long enough for me to hear her sharp intake of breath and the sound of papers shuffling frantically on her desk. "Mrs. Morrison, I had no idea." Her voice carried the particular strain that comes from realizing you have been operating under completely false assumptions about power dynamics. "The corporate structure is so complex and your husband never mentioned." "My husband has no involvement in Morrison Hospitality's business operations," I interrupted with the cold precision that had built my empire through hostile negotiations. "He has also demonstrated a concerning tendency to misrepresent both his authority and my consent regarding family financial matters." Diane's professional composure began crumbling as the implications of her situation became clear. She had accepted instructions from a man who possessed no authority over companies he did not own, while dismissing concerns from the woman who controlled every aspect of the wedding infrastructure. Her stammered attempts to salvage the situation proved futile because the damage had already been done through her participation in Scott's deception. "I need you to understand something very clearly, Diane. When my husband contacted you about excluding me from the Henderson Walsh wedding while preserving my financial contributions, he was exceeding any authority he has ever possessed. Those instructions violated both our professional agreements and basic business ethics. Mrs. Morrison, if I had known about the ownership structure, I would never have accepted those instructions. Our standard procedures require authorization from primary stakeholders for any significant changes to event coordination." Her desperation highlighted how completely Scott had underestimated both my business acumen and my industry relationships. He had assumed he could manipulate vendors who ultimately answered to me, dismissing the possibility that his quiet wife might command respect and loyalty throughout the hospitality sector. "Diane, I want you to contact every vendor associated with the Henderson Walsh wedding and inform them that their services are no longer required. All contracts should be terminated immediately, and all reservations should be cancelled." The silence that followed carried the weight of a woman realizing she was witnessing the systematic dismantling of months of careful planning. "Mrs. Morrison, are you certain about this decision? The wedding is scheduled for next month, and finding replacement services will be virtually impossible on such short notice." "I am completely certain. My family made a business decision to exclude me while retaining my funding. Now they will learn what happens when you betray someone who controls the entire industry infrastructure you depend upon." The cancellation process unfolded with surgical precision over the following hours. Each vendor received official notice that their services were no longer required for the Henderson Walsh celebration. Every contract was legally terminated according to the clauses my legal team had crafted years earlier to protect Morrison Hospitality's interests. Each hotel reservation was cancelled, each catering arrangement was dissolved, and each venue booking was eliminated from the system. I did not act from emotional impulse or desire for petty revenge. This was the calculated response that had built my empire through strategic thinking and consequences for those who violated business relationships. Frank and Sarah had made a choice to participate in my humiliation while benefiting from my generosity. Now they would discover that choices carry consequences, especially when you choose to betray someone who controls the infrastructure your dreams depend upon. The power I wielded in this moment felt different from anything I had experienced during 15 years of marriage. For decades, I had accepted dismissive treatment from Scott's family, funded their various needs and desires while remaining invisible, and prioritized their comfort over my own recognition and respect. I had played the role of the quiet, accommodating family member while building an empire that dwarfed their comprehension. But now, for the first time in my marriage, I felt the pure intoxication of exercising power without apology or restraint. The family that had casually discarded me while keeping my money was about to learn that the quiet woman they had underestimated held every card in this particular game. Years of accepting minimal recognition while providing maximum support suddenly seemed like strategic patience rather than virtuous self-sacrifice. My assistant entered my office with updates on the cancellation process, her expression carrying the mixture of professional efficiency and personal concern that characterized our working relationship. Mrs. Morrison, all vendor notifications have been completed. Several companies have requested confirmation of these instructions, given the unusual circumstances and short timeline. Tell them that Morrison Hospitality's decision is final and non-negotiable. Any vendor who cannot accept these instructions should review their contractual obligations regarding parent company directives. The cascade of consequences would begin within hours. Frank and Sarah would receive calls from confused vendors explaining that their services were no longer available. Hotel reservations would disappear from the system, catering arrangements would be dissolved, and the venue booking that had seemed secure would evaporate without explanation. The celebration they had planned for months would disintegrate in a single afternoon because they had chosen to betray the woman who unknowingly controlled every component of their wedding infrastructure. This revelation transformed my understanding of relationships, power, and self-worth in ways that 15 years of successful business operations had never achieved. I had spent decades believing that quiet generosity and patient accommodation represented virtue, that funding others' dreams while remaining invisible demonstrated character and family loyalty. Instead, I now recognized these behaviors as enabling patterns that had taught my family to take my contributions for granted while treating me as disposable. The quiet woman they had all underestimated was finally playing at her actual capability level, and the game had fundamentally changed in ways they could not yet comprehend but would very soon experience directly. The consequences began unfolding within hours, cascading through the wedding planning network like dominoes falling in precisely calculated sequence. My office phone rang first with Teresa's number, and I allowed it to ring 3 times before answering, savoring the anticipation of her confusion and growing panic. "Teresa, something terrible is happening." Her voice carried a tremor I had never heard before, higher-pitched and breathless with the kind of desperation that accompanies watching carefully constructed plans disintegrate in real time. Every single vendor just called to cancel their services. The venue, the caterer, the hotel reservations, everything is gone. I maintained professional composure while noting the delicious irony that she was calling the woman they had excluded for help with problems created by that very exclusion. "That sounds extremely concerning, Teresa. Have the vendors provided any explanation for these cancellations?" "They all claim it's due to corporate policy changes or parent company directives, but none of it makes sense. We signed contracts months ago, paid deposits, confirmed everything multiple times. How can they just cancel with no warning?" Her bewilderment was complete and satisfying. Teresa had no concept that the woman she had helped betray actually controlled every vendor she was desperately trying to retain. The tears in her voice, which had once moved me to write generous checks, now sounded like justice being served with mathematical precision. "Have you tried contacting alternative vendors?" I asked with the helpful tone I had always employed during family crises, though this time my assistance would prove remarkably limited. That's the impossible part. Every decent venue in the Phoenix area is suddenly booked solid. Every quality caterer claims they have no availability. Every hotel we've called shows no vacancy for our dates. It's like the entire industry coordinated to shut us out. The accuracy of her assessment was remarkable. The industry had indeed coordinated to shut them out, though she remained oblivious to the coordinator's identity. My 15 years of strategic acquisitions had created a network so comprehensive that finding alternatives required looking beyond the quality standards Frank and Sarah had originally established for their celebration. "I've been calling for 6 straight hours," Teresa continued, her voice breaking with exhaustion and frustration. "I even tried vendors in Tucson and Flagstaff, but they're either booked or unwilling to travel for our date. I don't understand what's happening." Frank's call came 20 minutes later, his architectural training evident in his methodical approach to problem-solving, though his logic proved useless against the reality of my market dominance. Unlike Teresa's emotional pleading, Frank attempted to analyze the situation with professional detachment that gradually crumbled as the scope of the disaster became apparent. "Teresa, I need to ask you something directly," Frank began with the measured tone he used for client consultations. Do you have any idea why every vendor associated with our wedding would suddenly cancel their services on the same day? That does seem like an unusual coincidence, I replied, maintaining the helpful family member persona that had served me well for 15 years. Have you considered whether someone with significant industry influence might have reasons for these actions? The pause that followed stretched long enough for me to hear him processing the implications of my suggestion. Frank was intelligent enough to recognize that such coordinated cancellations required substantial power and organization, though he had not yet connected these requirements to his quiet sister-in-law who supposedly ran a small catering business. Are you suggesting that someone is deliberately sabotaging our wedding? His voice carried growing alarm as the possibility of intentional interference replaced his initial assumption of unfortunate coincidence. Who would have both the motivation and the capability to coordinate something like this? I wouldn't want to speculate about motivations, I said carefully, but the capability part is interesting. This level of coordination would require someone with extensive connections throughout the hospitality industry, someone whose influence extends across multiple vendor categories. Frank's silence suggested he was beginning to understand that his wedding had been targeted by someone with resources and reach far beyond typical family drama. The man who designed buildings was finally grasping that his celebration had been systematically demolished by an architect of consequences he had never bothered to acknowledge. Scott's response proved far less analytical and infinitely more revealing about his true character when faced with situations beyond his control. His calls began with the dismissive authority he had always employed when my business activities inconvenienced his family plans, but his tone shifted rapidly as he realized that his usual tactics would prove inadequate for this crisis. "Teresa, you need to fix this mess immediately," Scott commanded during his first call, his voice carrying the entitled assumption that I would naturally prioritize solving problems created by his betrayal. "Frank is in full panic mode and Teresa hasn't stopped crying for hours. Whatever game you're playing needs to stop right now." The casual characterization of systematic consequences as games revealed how completely Scott misunderstood both the situation and my response to his orchestrated humiliation. He genuinely believed that his wife's reaction to theft and betrayal represented childish behavior that reasonable adults should ignore rather than recognizing it as the calculated exercise of legitimate power. "I'm not playing any games, Scott. I'm simply allowing natural consequences to unfold when people make choices about betraying family members who have been generous with them." "Natural consequences?" His voice rose with genuine indignation. "You're destroying Frank's wedding out of spite because your feelings got hurt. This is exactly the kind of emotional instability we were trying to avoid by keeping you away from the celebration." The victim blaming reached stunning heights as Scott transformed his theft and betrayal into evidence of my mental health problems. He had orchestrated my exclusion while stealing my money, then characterized my response as proof that his original decision was justified. The circular logic would have been impressive if it were not so morally bankrupt. "Scott, you excluded me from a wedding I funded completely while keeping my $40,000. If you can explain how that represents reasonable family behavior, I'm willing to listen. You offered that money as a gift, Teresa. Gifts don't come with strings attached and they don't give you the right to control other people's celebrations. Your success has made you think you can buy your way into situations where you're not wanted." The accusation revealed resentments that had probably festered throughout our marriage. Scott viewed my business achievements as arrogance rather than recognizing the dedication and intelligence that built Morrison Hospitality from nothing into a regional empire. This wedding crisis was not about family harmony but about diminishing a wife whose success threatened his ego and challenged his assumptions about domestic power dynamics. Within 48 hours, word began spreading through Phoenix's hospitality community that Teresa Morrison was exercising the full scope of her considerable influence. Vendors who had treated me with routine professionalism suddenly understood they had been dealing with industry royalty whose quiet demeanor had masked unprecedented market control. Competitors who had underestimated Morrison Hospitality began reassessing their market position and their relationship strategies with someone they had not realized was a major power broker. My assistant fielded calls from industry colleagues seeking to understand the implications of the Henderson-Walsh cancellations for their own business relationships. Hotel managers who had accepted routine booking requests now recognized they had been dealing with the owner of competing properties. Catering companies that had viewed Morrison Hospitality as another regional player suddenly understood they were operating in markets dominated by a competitor whose influence they had never recognized. The quiet woman who had preferred anonymous generosity was revealing the true scope of her empire, and the entire southwestern hospitality industry was taking notice of power they had never bothered to acknowledge or respect. My reputation was transforming from successful businesswoman to force of nature, and the recognition felt intoxicating after decades of accepting invisibility in both professional and personal relationships. The chaos surrounding Frank's wedding represented just the beginning of consequences that would reshape how everyone involved understood power, loyalty, and the cost of betraying someone whose influence extended far beyond their comprehension. The industry whispers reached their crescendo by the end of the week, creating the perfect atmosphere for what I had planned as the final act of this family drama. I scheduled the meeting for Monday morning at Morrison Hospitality headquarters, sending formal invitations to Scott, Frank, Sarah, Teresa, and both sets of parents through my assistant with the clinical precision of a corporate summons. The 32nd floor conference room had been chosen specifically for its intimidating atmosphere. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of downtown Phoenix, while walls displayed industry awards, acquisition certificates, and original artwork that collectively represented more wealth than my family's combined annual earnings. The conference table, crafted from a single piece of Arizona mesquite and surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, served as the perfect stage for revelations that would reshape every relationship in the room. They arrived separately but within minutes of each other, their faces carrying the shell-shocked expressions of people whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally altered over the preceding week. Scott entered first, his usual confident bearing replaced by the uncertain posture of a man who had discovered that his quiet wife controlled forces beyond his comprehension. His pale complexion and the slight tremor in his hands revealed how thoroughly the recent revelations had shaken his assumptions about domestic power dynamics. Frank and Sarah followed, both wearing the careful neutrality of people attempting to navigate a crisis they still did not fully understand. Frank's architectural training was evident in how he studied the conference room, taking note of details that spoke to wealth and influence he had never associated with his sister-in-law. Sarah maintained the composed facade she had perfected over recent days, though her wide eyes betrayed growing recognition that she was entering the domain of someone whose power extended far beyond family relationships. Teresa entered last with both sets of parents, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had spent days frantically attempting to rebuild a celebration that had disintegrated overnight. The woman who had participated in my betrayal now confronted the reality that her search for alternative vendors had been futile because the woman she had helped exclude controlled the infrastructure she desperately needed. I had positioned myself at the head of the conference table, wearing a navy Armani suit and the confidence that comes from holding every card in a game where the other players were still learning the rules. The morning light streaming through the windows created dramatic shadows across the room while highlighting the awards and recognition that documented Morrison Hospitality's rise to regional dominance. Thank you all for coming, I began with the professional tone I reserved for high-stakes negotiations. I believe we have several important matters to discuss regarding recent events and their implications for our family relationships. The silence that followed was profound and satisfying. These were the same people who had talked over me at dinner tables for years, dismissing my business opinions while celebrating achievements that paled beside my own accomplishments. Now they sat in my conference room, surrounded by tangible evidence of influence they had never bothered to acknowledge, finally understanding that the quiet family member held absolute power over their immediate situation. Frank broke the family's coordinated defense with words that surprised me in their directness and apparent sincerity. He stood slowly, looked me directly in the eye, and spoke with the steady voice I remembered from our better family moments before this crisis had revealed everyone's true character. Teresa, I want to apologize not just for myself but for all of us. What we did was completely inexcusable. His acknowledgement carried genuine remorse rather than the strategic contrition I had expected from someone whose wedding had been systematically dismantled. I should have questioned the decision to exclude you while keeping your financial contribution. I should have recognized that no family harmony could justify treating you with such disrespect. His willingness to accept responsibility while Scott continued maintaining defensive silence revealed character that had been hidden beneath family loyalty and social pressure. Frank's moral courage in this moment planted the first seed of possible redemption, though forgiveness remained a distant consideration rather than an immediate possibility. "Frank, your apology is noted," I replied with careful neutrality. However, apologies do not address the systematic nature of what occurred or the coordinated deception that multiple family members participated in creating. Scott finally found his voice, though his words carried the desperate edge of someone whose worldview was crumbling under the weight of evidence and consequences. "Teresa, you have to understand that we were trying to prevent family drama. The exclusion was never meant as an insult. It was meant to protect everyone from uncomfortable situations." "Protect everyone from uncomfortable situations by stealing my money and orchestrating my humiliation?" I asked with the calm precision that had served me through countless business confrontations. "Scott, please explain how theft and betrayal qualify as protective measures." His attempts to minimize the betrayal and rationalize the exclusion became increasingly desperate as he realized that his usual tactics of dismissal and condescension would prove inadequate in this environment. When he finally grasped that his wife controlled not just their personal finances but an entire regional industry, his defensive anger transformed into bargaining that revealed the depth of his dependence on systems he had never bothered to understand. "You're right that the execution was flawed," Scott admitted with visible reluctance, "but the intentions were good. We can fix this situation if everyone just steps back from the emotional reactions and focuses on family unity." The casual characterization of calculated consequences as emotional reactions demonstrated how completely Scott misunderstood both the situation and my response to his orchestrated betrayal. He genuinely believed that his wife's exercise of legitimate power represented hysteria that reasonable people should ignore rather than recognizing it as the natural result of choices that carried significant consequences. "The situation has already been fixed, Scott. Your brother's wedding was cancelled because the family that planned my exclusion discovered they had no alternatives when I withdrew my support. The emotional reactions you reference are the natural response to learning that actions carry consequences." I stood and walked to the windows overlooking downtown Phoenix, allowing the silence to emphasize the authority that my position and environment represented. The city stretched below us, much of its hospitality infrastructure unknowingly controlled by the woman Scott's family had dismissed as running a small catering business. However, I am prepared to offer terms for resolution that will allow Frank and Sarah to proceed with their celebration, albeit under conditions that reflect the new reality of our family relationships. The room held its collective breath as I outlined requirements that would reshape every assumption they had maintained about power, respect, and accountability within our extended family structure. The terms were not negotiation starting points but non-negotiable conditions that reflected the cost of betraying someone whose influence extended far beyond their comprehension. $75,000, payable in advance to cover all wedding expenses. Formal written apologies from Scott, Teresa, and both sets of parents acknowledging that your treatment was unacceptable and violated basic standards of family loyalty. Public recognition during the wedding reception of what nearly destroyed this celebration and why these events occurred. The financial requirement represented nearly double the original wedding cost, while the public acknowledgement would ensure that every guest understood the consequences of betraying family members whose generosity had been taken for granted for years. These terms are final and non-negotiable. You have 48 hours to decide whether Frank and Sarah will have their wedding under these conditions or whether they will be explaining to 60 guests why there is no celebration at all. The 48-hour deadline passed with Frank's acceptance delivered through a formal letter that arrived at Morrison Hospitality precisely at the end of business hours on Wednesday. His handwriting carried the careful precision of an architect who understood that some structures require complete reconstruction rather than simple repairs. The $75,000 appeared in my business account the following morning, accompanied by written apologies from each family member that ranged from Frank's genuinely contrite acknowledgement to Scott's grudging admission of poor judgment. 4 weeks later, I stood in the main hall of Canyon View Lodge, overseeing final preparations for what had transformed from Frank and Sarah's original vision into something entirely different yet undeniably beautiful. The venue represented one of Morrison Hospitality's smaller properties, nestled against the desert foothills with panoramic mountain views that created natural magnificence no amount of money could purchase or replicate. The guest count had been reduced from 60 to 40, forcing focus on genuine relationships rather than social performance and obligation. Each invitation had been carefully reviewed to ensure that only people who truly mattered to Frank and Sarah would witness their union. The elimination of peripheral guests and acquaintances created an intimacy that the original celebration would never have achieved despite its greater expense and elaborate planning. Every detail reflected my aesthetic vision rather than the ostentatious display Frank and Sarah had initially envisioned. Elegant simplicity replaced the gaudy excess they had originally planned, with desert wildflowers arranged in understated centerpieces that complemented rather than competed with the natural landscape. The reduced budget had paradoxically produced a more sophisticated celebration, one that emphasized the significance of the commitment being made rather than the wealth being displayed. My assistant approached with the final vendor confirmations, each document bearing the signatures of service providers who now understood they were working directly for Morrison Hospitality rather than through intermediary planners. The shift in their demeanor had been remarkable to observe. Vendors who had treated me with routine professionalism now provided the deference typically reserved for industry leaders whose influence could make or destroy regional businesses. Mrs. Morrison, the catering team has confirmed all final menu adjustments, and the photographer understands that you will be reviewing all images before release. My assistant reported with the efficiency I had come to expect from staff who recognized they worked for someone whose power extended far beyond what most clients could wield. The transformation in how Phoenix's hospitality community regarded me had been profound and gratifying. Word had spread throughout the industry about the quiet mogul who had nearly canceled a family wedding over betrayal, with the story growing in dramatic detail through each retelling. Competitors who had underestimated Morrison Hospitality now approached me with the careful respect reserved for forces of nature that could reshape market conditions through single decisions. The incident had elevated my professional reputation from successful businesswoman to industry legend, though the cost in family relationships remained to be determined. My willingness to exercise power when betrayed had sent clear messages throughout the community about the consequences of crossing Teresa Morrison, whether in business dealings or personal relationships. During the cocktail hour, I observed Frank moving through the smaller gathering with visible relief rather than the stress that had characterized his behavior during the original planning process. The reduced guest count allowed him to engage meaningfully with each person present rather than performing social obligations for acquaintances who attended celebrations primarily for networking opportunities. Sarah appeared genuinely radiant in a simpler dress that suited the intimate venue better than the elaborate gown she had originally selected. The woman who had maintained plausible deniability throughout the crisis now carried herself with the careful gratitude of someone who understood that her wedding existed only because of forgiveness she had not necessarily earned but desperately needed. When Frank stood to address the gathering during dinner, his words carried weight that transcended typical wedding reception speeches. The man who had found moral courage to acknowledge wrongdoing continued demonstrating character growth that distinguished him from family members who remained focused on minimizing their accountability. Before Sarah and I exchange our vows, I want to acknowledge someone whose generosity and forgiveness made this celebration possible despite our family's serious failures. Frank began, his voice carrying across the intimate gathering with genuine emotion rather than performed gratitude. Teresa Morrison did not just fund our wedding. She preserved our family's integrity when we had abandoned it ourselves. Her willingness to rebuild what we had destroyed through our selfishness and betrayal represents character that we should all aspire to emulate. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine rather than the polite acknowledgement I had grown accustomed to at family events. Even guests who had not been privy to the complete story understood that something significant had occurred, that the woman being recognized had demonstrated extraordinary grace under circumstances that would have justified much harsher consequences. Frank continued with specific acknowledgement of my sacrifice and character that represented public vindication I had never demanded but had always deserved. Teresa taught us that real strength is not about dominating others but about using power responsibly when others fail to show basic respect and decency. Sarah stood from the head table, her eyes bright with emotion that appeared genuine rather than strategic. The bride who would build her marriage on the foundation of my forgiveness finally seemed to understand the gravity of what her family had nearly destroyed through their calculated betrayal. "I want to publicly apologize for our family's treatment of Teresa," Sarah said, her voice carrying enough emotional weight to suggest authentic learning rather than performed contrition. We responded to extraordinary generosity with disrespect and betrayal. We accepted her money while excluding her presence, which represents a moral failure that I will remember for the rest of my life. Her admission of family accountability in front of wedding guests created the public recognition of wrongdoing that private apologies could never have achieved. The woman who had maintained careful neutrality throughout the crisis was finally acknowledging the ethical bankruptcy of their coordinated exclusion while accepting my funding. Teresa did not just save our wedding, Sarah continued, tears now visible on her face. She taught us about treating people with the dignity they deserve regardless of whether they can benefit us. I hope that our marriage will demonstrate the kind of integrity and loyalty that she has shown to our family despite having every reason to abandon us completely. As the evening progressed, I found myself genuinely enjoying the celebration for the first time in recent memory. The intimate gathering allowed for meaningful conversations rather than superficial social interactions, while the knowledge that every detail existed on my terms created satisfaction that mere attendance could never have provided. Scott remained notably subdued throughout the evening, his usual dominant personality replaced by the careful behavior of someone who had learned that his assumptions about family power dynamics required fundamental revision. The man who had dismissed my achievements for 15 years now moved through my rebuilt celebration with the recognition that his wife controlled forces he had never bothered to understand or respect. The mountain sunset created a natural backdrop for Frank and Sarah's first dance, painting the desert sky in colors that no decorator could replicate or improve upon. The celebration was beautiful, elegant, and meaningful in ways that their original plans would never have achieved, despite costing nearly double and requiring public acknowledgement of family failures that would be remembered long after the dancing ended. The sun was barely visible through our kitchen windows when Scott appeared the next morning, carrying an expensive bouquet of white roses and wearing the haggard expression of a man who had spent the night rehearsing apologies. His formal attire from the wedding still wrinkled from what appeared to be a sleepless night, and his eyes carried the particular exhaustion that comes from finally understanding the magnitude of consequences you had not anticipated. Teresa, we need to talk about what comes next. His voice carried the careful modulation of someone who had practiced these words repeatedly, though the underlying desperation remained impossible to disguise. I know I made serious mistakes, but we have been together for 15 years. That history has to count for something in how we move forward from this situation. I continued preparing my morning coffee with the same methodical precision I had employed throughout our marriage, measuring grounds and water with the attention to detail that had built Morrison Hospitality from nothing into a regional empire. The familiar routine provided stability while I processed the surreal experience of my husband pleading for forgiveness in the kitchen where we had shared thousands of ordinary moments over the past decade and a half. 15 years. I repeated, testing the weight of those words against the reality of what had occurred. 15 years during which you benefited from my success while treating my achievements as insignificant hobby activities. 15 years of accepting your family's dismissive treatment while I funded their various needs and desires. 15 years that culminated in you stealing my money while orchestrating my public humiliation. Scott set the roses on our granite countertop with the careful movements of someone who understood that grand gestures would prove inadequate for the damage he had inflicted. I understand you're angry, and you have every right to be upset about how the wedding situation was handled. But Teresa, we can work through this. Marriage counseling, whatever you need. We built a life together that matters more than any single mistake. The characterization of systematic betrayal as a single mistake revealed how completely Scott continued to misunderstand both the situation and my response to his orchestrated cruelty. He genuinely believed that his decision to exclude me while stealing my money represented an error in judgment rather than a fundamental revelation about his character and his understanding of our marriage. Scott, you did not make a mistake. You made a calculated decision to humiliate me while preserving access to my financial resources. That represents who you are when you believe the consequences will remain manageable. Through the kitchen window, I could see my Range Rover in the driveway, already loaded with everything I considered essential from our 15-year marriage. The packing process had been surprisingly simple, requiring only 2 hours to collect the possessions that held genuine emotional significance. Practical necessities, important documents, and sentimental items fit easily into luxury vehicle storage, illustrating how little of our shared existence actually belonged to me on any meaningful level. The physical act of packing had revealed the emotional detachment I had unconsciously developed over years of accepting minimal recognition while providing maximum support. 15 years of marriage reduced to items that filled a single vehicle, with the remainder representing shared acquisitions that had never truly felt like home. "You packed the car," Scott observed, his voice carrying the hollow recognition of someone who had finally understood that words would prove insufficient to address the damage he had created. "Teresa, please don't make any permanent decisions while emotions are running high. We can rebuild trust if you give us the opportunity to work through this together." My phone buzzed against the counter with an incoming message from Frank, and I opened it to find a photo from the previous evening showing him and Sarah cutting their wedding cake. Both faces radiated genuine happiness despite the reduced circumstances and the public acknowledgement of family failures that had preceded their celebration. Below the image, Frank had written a message that carried more emotional weight than any of Scott's carefully crafted apologies. "Thank you for being the foundation that made this joy possible. Your forgiveness taught us about real strength and character. We will never forget what you did for us or the lessons you taught our family about treating people with the respect they deserve." The contrast between Frank's continued character growth and Scott's focus on minimizing his accountability illustrated the fundamental difference between genuine remorse and strategic damage control. The man whose wedding I had nearly canceled was demonstrating moral development, while my husband of 15 years remained primarily concerned with preserving access to the lifestyle my success provided. "Frank sent a thank you message," I said, showing Scott the phone screen. "He continues to acknowledge what occurred and express genuine gratitude for the forgiveness he received. You might consider whether his approach offers lessons about accountability and growth." Scott glanced at the message with visible irritation. Frank's situation was different. He was not responsible for the family decisions about guest arrangements. I was trying to prevent drama and protect everyone from uncomfortable situations that would have ruined his special day. The persistent refusal to acknowledge the theft and betrayal that had actually occurred revealed how completely Scott remained committed to his original narrative despite overwhelming evidence of its moral bankruptcy. He continued characterizing my exclusion as drama prevention rather than recognizing it as systematic humiliation coordinated with casual cruelty. "Scott, you stole $40,000 from me while orchestrating my public humiliation. No amount of rationalization transforms that reality into family protection or drama prevention." I picked up my purse and car keys from the counter where I had placed them the previous evening, feeling the weight of finality that comes with decisions that cannot be reversed or reconsidered. The kitchen that had hosted 15 years of shared meals, morning conversations, and quiet moments of marital intimacy now felt like a museum of experiences that belonged to people we no longer were. "Where are you going?" Scott asked, though his tone suggested he already understood that his window for salvaging our marriage had closed while he continued making excuses rather than accepting responsibility. "Away from you, away from your family, away from relationships where my contributions are valued while my presence is considered problematic." I moved toward the door that led to the garage, where my packed Range Rover waited to carry me toward a future that did not include people who confused generosity with weakness. "Teresa, please do not do anything irreversible while you are still processing what happened. We can work through this if you give our marriage the chance it deserves after 15 years together." Behind me, Scott's voice carried the desperation of someone who had finally comprehended what he was losing, though his pleas remained focused on his own losses rather than the damage he had inflicted through his betrayal. His calls of my name echoed through the kitchen with increasing urgency as he realized that words alone would prove insufficient to repair trust that had been systematically destroyed through calculated deception. But I did not look back because I had spent 15 years looking back, making excuses for behavior that should have been unacceptable, accepting minimal recognition from people who should have celebrated my contributions to their lives. The garage door opened with mechanical precision, revealing morning sunlight that illuminated the path toward a future where my worth would not be determined by people who claimed to love me while treating me as disposable. The finality of that moment represented not just the end of a marriage but the conclusion of a chapter where I had accepted being undervalued by people who should have treasured what I brought to their relationships. The Range Rover's engine hummed to life as I backed out of the driveway that had framed 15 years of shared domestic routines, leaving behind Scott's silhouette in the kitchen window and the weight of expectations that had defined my marriage since its beginning. The phoenix mornings stretched before me with possibilities I had not allowed myself to consider during decades of prioritizing family harmony over personal fulfillment. 3 months later, Morrison Hospitality occupied a new headquarters building in Scottsdale, its glass facade reflecting desert sunlight while housing the expanded operations that had followed my emergence as a recognized industry force. The wedding drama had transformed my professional reputation in ways that traditional marketing campaigns could never have achieved, attracting clients who wanted to associate with someone whose influence extended beyond typical business relationships. The story had evolved through countless retellings throughout the southwestern hospitality community, becoming industry legend about the quiet mogul who had nearly canceled a family wedding over betrayal. Each version emphasized different details, but the central narrative remained consistent. Teresa Morrison commanded resources and wielded influence that most industry professionals had never recognized, and her willingness to exercise that power when betrayed sent clear signals about the consequences of crossing someone whose quiet demeanor masked unprecedented capabilities. New clients approached Morrison Hospitality not merely for event planning services but for association with someone who had demonstrated that respect and loyalty were non-negotiable requirements rather than suggestions. Corporate executives who had built their careers on power dynamics understood the significance of what had occurred, recognizing that my systematic dismantling and reconstruction of Frank's wedding represented strategic thinking that translated directly into business acumen they wanted supporting their own important events. My assistant entered my new corner office with the afternoon's correspondence, including another message from Frank that demonstrated the continued character growth he had maintained since his wedding day. His communications had evolved from grateful acknowledgement into genuine friendship based on mutual respect rather than family obligation or financial dependence. "Teresa, I wanted to share some news that I think will interest you," his latest message read. "Sarah and I have decided to establish an annual scholarship fund for hospitality management students, funded through a percentage of my architectural firm's profits. We learned from you that success carries responsibility to support others, and we want to honor that lesson in a meaningful way." The contrast between Frank's continued moral development and Scott's increasingly desperate attempts at reconciliation illustrated the fundamental difference between people who learn from consequences and those who simply endure them. While Frank transformed his experience into positive action that would benefit future generations, Scott remained focused on minimizing his accountability while seeking restoration of privileges he had forfeited through betrayal. My divorce attorney had reported Scott's latest settlement proposal that morning, another in a series of increasingly generous offers that revealed his growing understanding of what he had lost through his calculated cruelty. The man who had dismissed my achievements for 15 years now offered to accept minimal financial support in exchange for preserving some connection to the lifestyle my success had provided. Living alone in my new Scottsdale residence had initially challenged assumptions I had maintained about solitude and companionship throughout my adult life. The silence I had feared would feel overwhelming instead provided space for reflection and decision-making that had been impossible during years of accommodating other people's needs and expectations. My homes, my businesses, and my relationships now reflected standards I established rather than compromises I accepted to maintain family harmony. The peace that came from being surrounded by people who could not casually dismiss or betray me proved more satisfying than the companionship I had shared with individuals who treated my contributions as entitlements rather than gifts. 15 years of accepting minimal recognition while providing maximum support had ended, replaced by solitude that honored my worth rather than diminishing it through constant accommodation of people who confused generosity with weakness. Evening brought another ritual I had developed since leaving Scott, reviewing Morrison Hospitality's expanding portfolio while enjoying wine from my private collection in the quiet of my home office. The numbers continued reflecting growth that exceeded projections, driven partly by the enhanced reputation that family drama had inadvertently created throughout the industry. The intercom announced a call from Marcus Chin, my business partner, who had become one of the few people whose counsel I sought on matters extending beyond professional concerns. His perspective on the wedding situation had proved invaluable during weeks when family emotions threatened to cloud business judgment. "Teresa, I wanted to update you on something interesting." Marcus began with the enthusiasm he reserved for particularly satisfying business developments. 3 of our major competitors have approached me about potential partnerships or acquisitions. Apparently, your demonstration of market control during the wedding situation has made them reconsider their strategic positions relative to Morrison Hospitality. The competitive landscape had shifted in response to revelations about my actual market share and willingness to exercise that influence when circumstances warranted decisive action. Companies that had previously viewed Morrison Hospitality as another regional player now understood they were operating in markets dominated by someone whose quiet approach had masked unprecedented consolidation of industry resources. More significantly, Marcus continued, 2 major hotel chains have contacted us about management contracts for their southwestern properties. They specifically mention wanting to work with someone who demonstrates the kind of strategic thinking and decisive leadership you showed during your family crisis. The transformation from successful businesswoman to industry legend continued generating opportunities that validated decisions I had made during the most difficult period of my personal life. The family drama that had nearly destroyed relationships had instead strengthened my professional position in ways that traditional business strategies could never have accomplished. As months passed, the story of Frank and Sarah's wedding became family folklore, though different listeners extracted different lessons from the experience. Some family members learned about the dangers of underestimating quiet strength and the importance of treating people with respect regardless of their position in social hierarchies. Others discovered that actions carry consequences even when those consequences are delayed by years of patient accommodation. A few relatives recognized that my transformation from invisible family financial resource to recognized matriarch represented justice rather than revenge. The natural result of people finally seeing clearly what had always been true about power dynamics they had chosen to ignore or misunderstand. The silent empress had always existed within Morrison Hospitality's expanding empire and my carefully constructed professional relationships. She had simply required the right circumstances to emerge from behind the accommodating persona I had maintained during decades of prioritizing family harmony over personal recognition. Those circumstances had arrived through Scott's betrayal and his family's coordinated cruelty, creating the catalyst necessary for relationships and reputations to align with realities that had been carefully concealed behind quiet generosity and patient support for people who had never deserved such consideration. The desert sunset painted my office windows with colors that money could not purchase while illuminating a future that finally reflected my actual capabilities rather than others' limited expectations of what the quiet woman could achieve when she stopped accepting less than she deserved. If this story of quiet strength turning into powerful justice had you captivated, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Teresa revealed she owned every single wedding vendor, watching their shock unfold in real time. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more incredible stories of underestimated women finding their power. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.